A lot of the value of crypto in my mind is just that when people make a lot of money in crypto, then they decide to take on projects that are interesting projects.
It feels like we're going through the next era of arts and philosophy and learnings.
This is like a gigantic social experiment that we've been seeing play out.
Welcome back to the Rollup, your home for technical talks and open conversations that shape the modular future. Nothing on today's show is to be construed as financial advice. You can see our full disclosures list at therollup.co/ventures. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode after a quick word from some of our awesome partners.
Ladies, gentlemen, Anons, and Degens, it is stablecoin season, brought to you by your favorite, the best in stablecoins, Frax. USD dollar stablecoin backed by the best in the business, the Biddle Fund by BlackRock and Superstate. This is stablecoin season. It is the yield-bearing stablecoin by Frax, coming soon to a chain near you.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rollup. Today we are joined by Robin Hanson, the man who makes other men look socially well-adjusted. He's calculated the odds of alien civilizations, the economics of uploading your brain, and probably the signaling value of appearing on this podcast, all before his morning coffee. When he's not busy making uncomfortable observations about human behavior that make us question our life choices, he's revolutionizing fields most of us didn't know existed. Please welcome George Mason University's resident futurist and the man most likely to casually mention post-human civilizations in small talk. Robin Hanson, welcome to the show. It's good to have you, man.
Nice to meet you both.
Also, father of prediction markets, mentor to Vitalik, I think, or at least the current prediction market schematic that we have on chain. Robin, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Have read a lot of your work, and it really has set the tone for, I think, a lot of the ideologies that we see in the crypto, blockchain, and just generally the technology space that we see now. When you're kind of considering the broad swath of work that you've put out there, what are some of the themes that tie it all together? Is there any kind of through lines or ideologies that you think are pretty consistent across the docket?
There's a bunch of different ways to try to frame me, and I'm probably too close to see, so you might be as good as I at judging between them. But one framing is to say I look for neglected important things that I can focus on. Another framing might be to say that I slowly realize that social institution problems are behind other problems, and I kept trying to sort of dig deeper to look for more meta problems. So I have this blog called Overcoming Bias, but when I first set it up, I had an alternative title and, picture and everything are ready to go, called More Meta Than Thou, because I was, going to say that I tend to think meta. So that's another way you could frame it. Otherwise, I guess I might be just idiosyncratic and weird, and then see things other people don't from my own peculiar, weird way. And in order to explain what I do that way, you'll have to know how I'm weird, I guess. Otherwise, you won't know how to predict what particular things I'd get into. But I'm going to have to say I'm not very good at knowing how I'm different from everything else or how to explain all the things I've done because I'm too close to it.
Our podcast has been quite primarily focused around the intersection of blockchain and crypto and the real world, right? And really have kind of branched off into AI as of recently, broader tech, and have spent the last 4 or 5 years thinking and coming from this very crypto native background, right? Like Robbie and I have seen, I dropped out of university in 2018 or 19 pursuing online business. Robbie finished his math and philosophy degrees, and we kind of rekindled 5 years ago to start this business together. And our bet was seeing something that people didn't already see, which was, it was very obvious to us that blockchain, cryptocurrency, and a non-government form of money was likely to persist in the world of AI, in the world of rapid digitization. So this isn't just an example of us taking a bet with our time and our career on something that others perhaps weren't able to kind of see as early or have still been yet to see. When you're looking back to some of the decisions of where you were spending your time and kind of how you were thinking about allocating your bandwidth, really. Sometimes when you're so early, it also feels the same as being wrong. And I'm curious if you have any stories of you being early to a particular phenomenon or idea that was so contrarian, that you felt wrong, and perhaps even how you dealt with being so early or so wrong in that time.
I mean, honestly, I think I'm just early on pretty much everything I've ever done. I'm still early, so I don't know that I've ever gotten past the early stage. Crypto, in my mind, is this corner of the world, and it's a small part of the whole world. And so when I come to talk to people in crypto, I have to sort of think about, like, how does this corner of the world relate to the rest of the world? Because people for this corner of the world do want to talk to me more. Now, I guess I was there early on when crypto anarchists were in Silicon Valley in the late 1980s or early 1980s. Early 1990s, where I sort of heard people initially thinking about crypto stuff and planning it, and I engaged it a bit, but it wasn't in the center of my attention. And so I can see that it's grown, and I've had a relation with it over the years. But I guess, how do I describe my relation to it? I guess there's two things. One is that most people find it just really hard to engage proposals for changes in mechanisms. So the world, a lot of my best ideas are ideas for changing how we could do things. And the world has mostly just yawned, not been very interested in that. And crypto is a part of the world where people are much more open to thinking about mechanisms. So if I describe a mechanism idea, you guys are open to that possibility, and you will engage it and think it through in terms of a mechanism. And you can imagine, that's not there now, but maybe it could exist in the future. So I have that affinity with crypto people, although I tend to think about mechanisms for just all the different main areas of our lives, and crypto people are focused on the mechanisms that they can implement in their crypto products and ventures. And so then there's the question of, I'm going to sort of tempt them to think of new ventures and new products that are not the ones they're working on now, because I've thought of all these other things. But it's great to have a set of people who are open to, mechanism innovations. So that's one key relation, I guess, I have to the crypto world. And the other relation I have to the crypto world is that, I'm interested in just a lot of unusual ideas and a lot of contrarian perspectives and options or things like that. And sort of grand projects and ambitious goals and visions. And crypto people, when they get into this world and they succeed and they win and they make a bunch of money, they have to tell themselves a story about why they deserve that. This is true for everybody. Anybody in the world who gets rich, they need a story about why I deserve this. And that story that they tell then pushes them to how they behave with the money after they get rich. And so if you get rich in dentistry, right, the story you tell about yourself is that you're a good dentist or whatever, and then you I don't know, golf or something, because that fits your story of what a good dentist does when he gets rich. But a crypto person, when they get rich, the story they tell themselves is, I got rich because I had this insight and vision into where the future is going, contrary to all those other people who don't get it. And then that story makes them do things with their money that, support that story. And then they do more interesting things with their money. So a lot of the value of crypto in my mind is just that when people make a lot of money in crypto, then they decide to take on projects that are interesting projects that are, related to contrarian views or things that could change, etc. So those are my two, in my mind, relations to the crypto world. One is you're open to mechanism changes, and the other is that you guys sort of have the same sort of vision of what it is to be interesting and what sort of projects are grand and inspiring that, I find the projects you do when you get rich interesting. I guess, but the closest connection obviously is going to be that some of my mechanism ideas over history are actually more appropriate for crypto, more feasible to implement in crypto. And so some crypto people are doing that. And that's maybe probably why you called me, as you've heard about those, and we could talk about those. But in my mind, they are just one of a number of different ideas for changing the world that I'm opportunistically would like anybody to talk about and try. But hey, over here, somebody's actually trying this stuff. And that's really exciting. That is relative to, like, for example, Futarchy, my governance mechanism, I wrote about in 1999, even 98. And so now, 26 years later, people are trying it. And so we'll finally get to see how well it works.
Double clicking on Futarchy a little bit, because this is one of the mechanisms that you described in a manifesto that you called "Vote Values but Bet Beliefs." And you didn't exactly term prediction markets; you termed this thing called decision markets, where essentially people could put their money.
Well, I did the prediction market thing 10 years before that. Let's be clear.
Okay, so maybe you could, yeah, please do trace us through the chronology of like what we see now today on chain. How did, like, when you were thinking about these things, what was your logical progression from your original inspiration through to the implementation we see today?
So I was a grad student at University of Chicago from 81 to 84, and I did philosophy of science and physics. And so I was thinking about what was wrong with academia and how to might fix that. And I read about cool stuff happening in Silicon Valley at the time. AI research was one, but other was this hypertext vision of how we might basically do the World Wide Web, which, if you understand the history, that was pretty early for people to be thinking about the World Wide Web in 1984, or 83, really, probably when I read that stuff. And so I went off to Silicon Valley to work with these two groups. I got a job doing AI at Lockheed initially, and then NASA later. And then I worked with a small group of people called Xanadu. Ted Nelson was their inspiration on how to make the World Wide Web. And their vision was the World Wide Web could help cure some of the ills of our intellectual conversation. And one of the main things they hoped was something called backlinks. That is, if somebody said something stupid, you could write a rebuttal, and then people could easily find your rebuttal from the stupid thing somebody said, and then that would make our conversation go better. And so in the process of working with these people for a few years, starting in 84 in Silicon Valley, I came to doubt whether merely having backlinks was really going to solve many of the problems we have in intellectual conversation. And I was hunting around for alternatives, and these people happened to be somewhat rabid libertarians, people who are interested in backlinks and the World Wide Web. And so the idea of betting markets was accessible to me through them. It wouldn't have been otherwise, because I didn't otherwise bet or have family members who bet or anything like that, or even did financial market trading. So, but the idea that a betting market would solve problems with conversation seemed plausible. That is, if we have something we're arguing about and we're getting bad estimates because we're listening to the wrong people or getting confused about things, then a betting market would just aggregate the best estimates on the question, and then those who really understood it better than the rest of us could bet and be proved right and make money, and those of us who didn't realize we weren't that sure if we knew what we were talking about would just back off and not bet, and then that would work well. So I had that idea around 88, 89 in Silicon Valley, hanging around with these other futurists who were thinking about various aspects of the future and AI and the web, which then did get going in 94, roughly. Then I started to write about how you could use betting markets to aggregate information and to have a healthier conversation. And I tried to sort of give talks and write some papers, and I inspired some people. And then in 94, when the World Wide Web first got going, one of the first things that happened, somebody made a betting market based on these ideas called Ideosphere. I think you can still find it. And the group of Xanadu that was trying to make the World Wide Web, they were funded and trying to make that happen, but then they got upstaged by Tim Berners-Lee and that version of the World Wide Web. And I introduced actually a prediction market in their Xanadu's private management, internal processes then. And then, I went back to grad school in 93, and I was a PhD student from 93 to 97 at Caltech. And then I did a 2-year postdoc, 97 to 99 at UC Berkeley in health policy. And then I got my current tenure track job in 99 here at George Mason. And during this period of time from 88, 89, when I first started thinking about what I called idea futures, which have since been called prediction markets, I evolved my thinking about what use cases were most interesting and what problems there were and how you could deal with them. So the way I started is the way most everybody starts, even say people who do prediction markets lately, they've started in the same place, which is we tend to think of the public conversation, the news, the public policy conversation as the place where we want markets to improve the conversation. And then if you think about it more, you say, well, look, information is mainly useful for advising decisions. And therefore, the most valuable markets for information would be the ones that advise the most valuable decisions. And where are those? And you realize, well, our most valuable decisions are in organizations. And how can you make a market useful for a decision? Well, what you want to do is make the market itself, its advice right next to the decision, just almost no translation. And so that's when I realized that decision markets, which are markets set up exactly to advise a particular decision by some particular organization, would be the most valuable form of prediction markets. And then I started writing about that, you see, around 99, which is 10 years after I first started thinking about prediction markets in, say, 88 or 89. And that's when I wrote about what I call Futarchy and decision markets. So decision markets would be just the general mechanism. And then I was trying to inspire people with the most dramatic, inspiring application. And that was for national governance. And that's what I call Futarchy. So that's a long explanation for, and then there's more sort of changes in my opinions over that 10 years about what was important and what were the problems and mechanisms for dealing with them. But basically, again, over the years, I continue to see whenever somebody gets new into the area, they first focus on what if we just had betting markets on public policy topics where the customer would be people who like to bet and argue about things. And I realized that's actually not the best application or the best customer. The best application is organizations who have decisions to make, and the best customer is that organization. They should be willing to pay to get their decision advised. And that's when I started to sort of focus on how could we create trials of that and motivate those customers to try out these mechanisms. And then, as we've said, in the last few years, there are actually crypto organizations that are doing this, that are concretely using decision markets to directly advise their organizational decisions. And so now we're getting some concrete experimentation with whether this works.
Yeah, and it took sense about, it really took the election for Polymarket to become a world renowned platform. I think one of the largest crypto app successes. I think prior to that, it had quite a bit of usage, but leading up to that was the major success. And it kind of takes me into an interesting train of thought around the self-fulfilling prophecy that these decision markets can lead to. And so I'm just curious, in your work, as you have explored the future possibilities of prediction markets and seeing the market for the Trump versus Biden last year be one of the largest ever. This really led me to think that there is a way where we can actually have these markets dictate reality in some sort of capacity, where if there's enough on the line, then there's a self-fulfilling prophecy mechanism that can be enabled through this. If there's enough willing bettors, or if the stakes are high enough for something that is being bet on in terms of an event, then there's a way for the world to kind of influence that, whether moral, immoral, or within the terms of conditions or not, if you can kind of get what I'm hinting at. So tying this into some of your theories around simulations, I'm very interested as to how you can understand the rise of prediction markets and decision markets being self-fulfilling prophecies, and then how this is kind of leading, or how this has influenced any of your thoughts with regards to us existing in a simulation. And if there's no through line here, then I can perhaps try to provide an example, but I see kind of a through line that I think you may be able to pick up.
Okay, so if we just look at the process of getting advice and getting information, there are kinds of advice or information that you can get where they might plausibly have a self-fulfilling prophecy effect or a self-refuting prophecy effect, depending on the kinds of information you ask for. But what we usually think we want is to try to sort of make that effect go away, so that the way we ask the question gets us at the information we want without creating this self-fulfilling or refuting prophecy effect. So, for example, in an election, the usual most popular market is, what decision will we make? Which is, the chance of somebody winning or losing. And then that could entice some people to sort of do the thing that they think we're going to do anyway, or it might induce people to rebel and defy and do the opposite of what they think we're going to do anyway. Either of those is the self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecy effect. But plausibly, what we more want is to know the effect of our choice. So imagine, say, we have a project with a deadline, and we want to know if we're going to make the deadline, so we can have a market on the deadline. Now, it could be that the odds of making the deadline are low, and that by warning the management that the odds of the deadline, making the deadline, are low, that induces them to reform how they're doing the project, change the requirements, resources, and then that makes them actually make the deadline. But by doing that, they've punished the people who warned them that they weren't going to make the deadline. And so that seems dysfunctional. Why should I bet that we won't make the deadline if, upon seeing my warning, you're going to change how you do it and you will make the deadline, right? So what we would rather do is have a market on, will you make the deadline if you don't change anything? Then I can give you the warning. If you don't change anything, you're in trouble. You're not going to make this deadline. But I could also have a market on, well, if you change resources or management of the project somehow, or the requirements, will you make the deadline then? And I might be able to be more optimistic about that. And so as a trader, I would rather give you the conditional advice that isn't subject to the self-fulfilling or refuting process, because that's the way in which I could more reliably give you the information I have and get paid for it. Whereas when I'm subject to the self-refuting thing, then I'm in trouble, right? My warning could well prevent me from getting paid for warning you. So that's why I think decision markets are so attractive. They're of the form, if we do this, what happens? Now, if the market says, if we do this will happen, and the only way that makes sense is if we do the other thing, so that's going to maybe encourage you to do the other thing. But we can end up with that same sort of self-fulfilling effect there. So whatever other things need to go into, if we do this, maybe you need to make that explicit and make several different options. If we do this and this, if we do this, but not that, etc. So I think the safe recommended thing is to be clear about the options, and then ask people to estimate the consequences of each option. And that then is more safe from the self-fulfilling or self-refuting effects, which I think you really want to get rid of. In order to entice people to give you good advice, you don't want them to have to guess about the self-refuting or self-fulfilling effect and which way it'll go and how it'll play out, because that could give you pretty misleading advice if they sort of misjudge those effects.
This is like a gigantic social experiment that we've been seeing play out, like prediction markets leading to decision markets, and then the most expansive form of this social experiment would be operating this at a government style level and making government decisions this way. You operated this in somewhat of a controlled experiment on a company level. Now we're seeing this play out in a broader social experiment on chain with polymarket and prediction markets there. As far as like where prediction markets will snowball outwards, I tend to think that blockchain is one of the best tools for social coordination. So we're seeing social experiments play out repeatedly, and we're seeing a lot of these social experiments in action today because they weren't possible before some of this technology, at least at this scale. We're also seeing this like in parallel, while we're seeing a lot of changes happen in the world, in governments, nation states, and geopolitically. Do you think that these social experiments that are currently happening in somewhat of an isolated, controlled silo will start to have a outsized impact or a more significant impact on some of the ways that major decisions are being made in some of these larger organizations like governments or nations?
So the most basic thing to know about innovation, pretty much all innovation ideas just get no response and are just completely ignored. And then that's on the one side. On the other side, people looking to maybe do something different are usually only look a short distance away from what they are currently doing. So the only people you really have much of a chance of enticing to do a new thing are the people pretty close to somebody else who's already tried that thing. So that's why, as a person with a new idea, you first just want anybody anywhere to try this thing. Because until anybody anywhere tries it, nobody is going to be willing to try anything. And so you're opportunistically like, anywhere it could plausibly work, let's get those people to try it. And then you'll be trying to get people near anywhere it's be tried to say, well, this is pretty much like your thing. Why don't you try it there? And people will often say, no, it's not as much like your thing as you think. So I'm relatively an abstract thinker, and many academics are. So to an abstract thinker, many things are pretty much the same thing. Whereas to a more concrete thinker, it's not the same thing at all because it was in a different organization at a different time with a different application, et cetera, right? So that's why I'm thrilled that anybody is trying any versions of these things. And if I thought the application had no chance of working, well, that wouldn't be so great. But as long as there's some chance of it working anywhere, I'm happy to support and give that a try. Now, so for example, Polymarket is an application of sort of betting markets where the customer is the people who want to bet. And that's not advising particular decisions mostly. So it's hard to point to Polymarket and say, see, you should go use a decision market for this decision of yours, because they'll say, that's not the same thing. But Polymarket, having sort of gotten big and done a bunch of things, they're just going to lower the costs of setting up the infrastructure to do any other thing you want to do. So, and they're going to make the ideas more accessible to people and make it easier to explain things to people whenever you want to do things. So in that sense, all these different variations help a bit because they all, work out some of the technology, lower some costs, create this, background knowledge that many people have about kinds of things that exist and how to work them. And so all of the different variations that do that help somewhat. Right. But then when you want to get to getting some particular person to try something, it tends to come down to, is there anybody nearby who has done almost the same thing? So that's why, I'm really excited to see these crypto organizations trying out Futarchy. And then, of course, they're getting similar organizations with similar decisions to also try them. And then it's spreading in that way. And that's exactly what you should expect. That far away things like, there's a stock market somewhere and a currency market there, and these other things, they are background things that sort of help. But honestly, the main thing is to get people to try specific things.
Yeah, that's been the never-ending fight that those involved in crypto have been fighting for It's just that we've yet to produce much outside of a handful of novel stablecoin based payment systems and a 24/7 kind of DeFi system. And I think we're kind of on the cusp now of like Polymarket leading the way amongst others for a more robust and user-centric normal person orientation of the space. Took some time in terms of user experience, in terms of education, as well as the broad perception of the space. But zooming out from the prediction markets and decision markets, going on a bit more of a thought exploration here. Robin, do you use AI on a daily basis? What is your current AI usage? Let's just start there.
I mean, I have a Chrome window with, half a dozen tabs to half a dozen different AIs. And then when I think of a question I think they might be able to answer, then I ask them the question, and that's a way that I can more quickly learn things. So I think that I have gotten into the habit of learning about things more quickly by, being able to know what kinds of questions you can ask and get an answer to. So yesterday I wanted to know, okay, they've got this 5% rule for announcing when you're trying to take over a company. How does that work? So I could just ask, so tell me about this 5% rule. And then they could go through and I look at that and I go, I don't think they hallucinated that. I think that sounds about right. Especially you can ask several of them and hope at least that they don't all hallucinate the same things. And so, that's the kind of usage I have, but I don't have it write letters for me or write essays for me or blog posts or things like that. And then it tends to give sort of a somewhat shallow analysis, basically. That is, you can see how there's a framing of things, and it's going to give you the framing that's most common in the writing that it's read. And if there's maybe a deeper framing to rethink it, it's not going to think of that or present that to you. So it's still up to you to consider different framings of what it says or of how to think about the question. So sometimes you can ask it about a different framing and then it'll go, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And then give you some reaction, but it's not usually going to spontaneously offer you the different framings.
No.
That might be useful.
And just to follow up there, before we kind of get into the main kind of macro view of what's happening here, do you think your students are using AI to do better in their classes?
Well, of course, I'm trying to be aware of and sort of limit, versions of that. For example, if I assign an essay topic, say to undergraduates, I purposely pick weird topics and that I can test that the large language models don't do very well on. So they just do better on topics that lots of people have written on and that they have integrated together. So if I asked a regular question like that, they could just use the language model, and I'm not sure I could tell a difference. So my main defense is to ask weird questions. And that'll work for a while, I guess, until maybe they get good at weird questions. But I can just generate even weirder questions. That is, it's a matter of sort of how far away from the usual discussion of the topics is your question. But you can see that I have a comparative advantage. I have lots of very weird, unusual lines of thinking on things. So that means I'm extra well prepared to, test students away from where the usual thinking is. Other professors who aren't as weird as me are going to have more trouble, right? Most of their lectures and most of their thinking goes down the usual lines of thought. And then when they ask questions about that, language models are all ready for them, right? So they're more in trouble. We weirdos are rewarded here.
I think Andy has some weird questions about AI he wants to ask you, but I would like to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole on the weird question thought line, because you recently posted a blog post on your Substack called Overcoming Bias, which is great. And it was basically about like, what do we want? And each person is individual and unique in what they want. But you basically said that, you want this insight into important neglected questions, which could abstractly be thought of as wisdom or knowledge, right? But I'm curious into like exactly, maybe just a couple of examples as to like which questions you think are the ones that are neglected. And this, I think, ties into the weird questions that you may ask your students.
Innovating finance, global, institutional, and on-chain.
deep liquidity to drive capital efficiency. Now, maximize yields on institutional grade liquid staking with METH. Unlock $1 trillion of capital via Bitcoin. All of this secured by Mantle's treasury of billions in stables and ETH capital pools. This entire ecosystem is coordinated by a vast network of seasoned VCs that are aiming to create the next generation of banking and financial technology. This is Mantle. RedStone modular oracles are available on 50 plus chains, trusted by over 100 clients and over 6 billion in total value secured. Visit redstone.finance to find out more.
If you just look about the world from an ordinary person's point of view, like aliens sound important. Sex sounds important, right? Pride seems important. There's just a bunch of concepts that are accessible to ordinary people that we mark as important concepts by the fact that we use them a lot and that we invoke them a lot in ordinary lives, right? So then if you go to the academic literature, you look at what topics they cover, and you'll often find that some of these most familiar ordinary topics like pride or sex or aliens, there's just not much of an academic literature, or say disagreement. And so that's right there saying, okay, here's an important concept, apparently from, even academics, they use these concepts a lot in their personal lives, say, but academics aren't studying them much. So right there, you've got important neglected. So it's not very hard to find important neglected stuff, really. Just notice the concepts you use in your life and the things that show up in your talks and discussion, and then look at the academic literature to see what they're talking about, and notice holes in the literature. So you'll have to read some academic literature to find that. So, you will have to spend some time reading academic literature in order to notice the holes. Okay, but if you spend enough time in the literature, the holes are easy to find. Neglected important stuff. The hard part is, do I have a way to make progress on this? Like maybe the reason they aren't working on it is because they couldn't figure out how, right? So the trick isn't so much to find important neglected stuff, although academics so get stuck in thinking about the way the literature is structured, they forget that there's this other metric of how ordinary people talk about things that is at odds with that to also apply. So some people, I know my colleagues especially, often I value them and we like each other because we have this sense of what the other metric of topic interestingness to compare to the academic metric in order to notice the holes. But so many academics don't even notice these holes because they're just too stuck in thinking in terms of the usual academic terminology and topics, right? So, but again, if you just bother to remember a persona inside yourself that, talks about things not in the usual academic ways, you will notice a different metric of what topics are important. You'll see these holes. So important neglected by itself, that's all it takes to do is to find important neglected things. But then the trick is, okay, but can you find an angle to make progress? And so that's what takes most of the work, is to sort of think about these familiar topics and think about all the tools we have, and then notice maybe where one of the tools could help you think about one of these important neglected topics. That's more the trick. And that, I think, takes more of a polymath habit. That is, if you just learn one particular field and one particular set of tools, and then you go and look at these ordinary topics, well, the hit rate's going to be pretty small, where the tools you've learned happen to give you insight into one of these, ordinary topics that people have neglected. But the more you learn a lot of different subjects with a lot of different methods, and then you go think about some ordinary topic like pride, then the more you could just draw on a lot of possible tools, and basically you'll be looking for a match where one of these tools looks like it might let you say something about that. So this is a strategy that increases in its effectiveness as you get older. So a polymath strategy is a strategy that peaks later in life, which is collect a lot of tools, just learn a lot of different areas, collect a lot of tools, and then notice the neglected topics and continue to ask for each one, which of these tools could say something to that. Now, one of the ways to think about this is to find puzzles. That is, if you look, one of the nice things about being a social scientist is that anytime you're dealing with the world of people, it's all data around you. And you should always be asking, does the thing I see around me, is this what my theories predict? And quite often you'll go, no, that's not what my theory would have predicted. And you'll be looking for these puzzles, patterns of behavior in the world that aren't actually predicted by your standard best theories. And now, well, that's a puzzle. Now it's not necessarily interesting unless it's near one of these important neglected topics. But often you'll find puzzles that are near the important neglected topics. And now you've got an angle. You've got a lever, you see, that you can use to try to weasel your way into the topic. So that's just one. There are other sorts of tricks, but the general idea here is retain your metric of ordinary person, what sort of topics matter, why, but also learn the different academic fields and their methods and how they see them and how they rate them. And then notice the mismatch, things that seem ordinarily important that aren't very studied. And then collect all these tools by which you're going to notice maybe a tool that happens to apply to near one of these holes. And then you're off and running. So, I could give you an example of the story, say, for any of the particular kinds of research I've done in my life. Maybe that would make it more vivid, but that's the abstract description.
I think one of the neglected and important questions that would be interesting is around the idea of needing to make more babies as a society. I think that would be a good example.
One thing is to notice that it's obviously important, right? That is, if we don't have babies, then we go away, right? That's pretty basic. And then to notice that we're in fact at risk of that, that's oh my goodness, that's obviously important. Is it neglected? Well, you go look at the literature and you see people kind of shrugging.
Well, it just seems like it's not a problem yet. It's we'll be fine. We have 7 billion people.
That's why you go, but it will be a problem. It's you can just project this forward. It's definitely going to be a problem. It's just not there yet. But hey, that's maybe one reason why it's neglected is people sort of have to wait to get slapped in the face with it. But
I think just one more thing to add into the mix is that we were told that we had an overpopulation crisis for a long time. And now all of a sudden, not only did we no longer have that problem, it's just suddenly the opposite.
Right. So that's one way to find neglected topics is there's just this momentum in various sermons and, moral crusades people have where they just find it hard to change their mind about these things when circumstances change. So the more you can realize that, hey, things change, the more you can find neglected topics. So that's a way in which this topic remains neglected because it's just, people get entrenched in these moral positions and activist sort of stances. But then you might say, well, okay, what angles, what sort of levers do we have? So now as an economist, I can just read and notice people predict that as population declines, soon then innovation will decline. And that just makes a huge difference. So right there, I've got I know this thing most people don't know. Innovation is far more central to the world than most people realize. And so if innovation goes away, that's an overwhelming fact about this scenario that makes you really motivated. This becomes even much more important than you realized. And then you can think about the different framings people have about this. And then I realized that, there's a simple framing that most people don't seem to apply. So there's this economist framing that even most economists don't apply because I read some literature on it, which is just, you have a life and there's a cost of producing it. And is the value of your life higher or less than the cost of producing it, right? And if the value of making your life is higher than the cost of producing it, there is some win-win deal by which we could make it happen. And then you want to ask, well, what would that deal look like? And, in simple economic analysis, the deal would be you pay your parents to exist. So the obvious economic, arrangement you expect for selfish people who have these differing interests and abilities is that the selfish kids who want to exist pay the selfish parents to raise them so that, the parents get paid and the kids exist. And that's a simple economic analysis of the situation, but that's not how anybody thinks about the situation. So you notice, there's a simple standard framing that's very well accepted as an intellectual tool that applies to the situation, but people are just not applying it. So that's a lever. You can say, I've got an angle, right? A way to make progress on this that other people aren't making progress because I found an angle. That's one angle. Okay. And so I can say, I can recommend, well, in the past, we've counted on parents to give this gift of life to their kids. And, maybe that worked fine in the past, but if somehow that's no longer the world we're in, there is this deal we could make. And now I can think about how we could set up this deal or how we could make variations. So basically you could say, well, look, one way that the deal would be made is the parent, endows the kid with debt or equity of some sort that they're obligated to pay back. And then the parent can sell that off to raise their expenses of child rearing. And now that works. And that would work, except everybody seems to hate this idea. It's terrible for parents to endow their kids with debt. That's just an immoral thing. But then you notice that, oh, but governments are already doing that and we don't mind. So every new kid is just automatically endowed with their share of the government debt. That just automatically happens. Nobody minds. And in fact, the size of that in the US, say, is $100,000 official debt, but like 300 to 700,000 of unfunded liabilities. And so there's this win-win deal. The parent, the government's going to get, if those unfunded liabilities are actually paid later, $300,000 to $700,000 from each kid. That's the value to the government of each kid. So if we just pay the parent a cut of that, it's a win-win deal, right? The governments win, the parents win, and the kids exist. So all we have to do is pay the parents some cut of the tax revenue that the government's going to get later, because we're already okay with endowing the kids with the debt with respect to government debt. And so now the usual contractual win-win deal can apply in this slight variation. And then I've found a policy that solves the problem because of noticing that, there's a way of thinking about it that other people don't think about it, but it's just very well accepted. I'm not being, contrarian or something. The idea of finding deals by which there's mutual benefit is extremely well established in economics. And then you notice the fact of government debt is just a fact of our world, right? So then you find the solution. But then the next thing you realize is, okay, this would be a win-win deal and it would just solve the problem, but people don't want to do it. Well, what's with that?
Well, they're on like Time magazine with like a guy and an older woman and an older man laying on the beach saying the childless life, and they're promoting it. So it's like shifting that.
Right. What happened to me was to realize that, okay, if I think about the proximate causes of fertility decline, which I'd read up, there are a bunch of key cultural trends, are pretty strong and striking cultural trends that are causing this decline. And the question is, why would there be a bunch of strong cultural trends causing this decline? And I guess another framing is to realize, look, low fertility is biologically maladaptive. So if you think of humans as a biological species, which is another framing that a polymath has accessible to them. Again, my trick is to sort of have lots of framings I can bring in to apply. So the framing of a biological species says low fertility in times of plenty is just maladaptive. Something's just wrong there. Why would there be a bunch of cultural trends producing maladaptive behavior and also producing this reluctance to actually take the solution I've designed? Then you realize culture is a powerful force here. It's so powerful it'll make people reluctant to adopt sort of the simple economic solution. It's a powerful force that's causing these declines. And I realized I've been a polymath for a long time, but I never studied culture. So that's an invitation, which I took it, a year and a half ago. Let's go learn some culture. So I decided to go add that to my portfolio of intellectual toolkits, study cultural evolution, see how it works, see what sort of the best standard theories of it are, so that I could make sense of this puzzle in front of me. Why is fertility declining because of a bunch of trends making it go down? And over the last year or so, I think I have successfully learned what we know about cultural evolution and in those terms made sense of this decline. And so then I've made sense of it in a way that doesn't seem to be accessible to other people. So then there's still this question, well, how did I find this angle other people don't find? I'm not sure exactly, but here's two sort of related things. So the world of cultural evolution. So here's a striking fact. Our most celebrated intellectuals, intellectuals we put the most high in our world, are cultural activists who in, prestigious Time magazine and New York Times, et cetera, argue for moving culture in particular directions. So the cultural warriors who push culture in different directions and argue for that, those are our most celebrated heroes. Then there are the academics who study the abstract process of cultural evolution, and they are pretty low status as academics. And they want to see themselves as scientists, but they feel kind of nervous that people don't respect their stuff very well. It looks kind of fuzzy and fluffy. So they're really emphasizing how scientific they are. They want to have mathematical equations and models and stuff like that. And part of being scientific is to not be political. So they are just really strictly going to not have comments on how we should run society and not take positions on that because they are scientists and they really want to emphasize how scientific they are and therefore independent. So from their point of view, if something's going wrong with culture, it's not up to them to say. Their job is just to study the process and tell the world how it works. So basically, I think there's something going wrong with culture. And so the puzzle is, well, why didn't these cultural evolution specialists figure this out before me? And why haven't they told anybody? So one part of the problem is that they're really so seeking to be scientists and rigorous that they won't go there. And then all the other people who are cultural activists, they don't really understand how cultural evolution works, actually. They just do the activism. And in fact, their activism is part of the problem. So they're not going to really, say that what they're doing is bad and wrong because they're getting so much celebration for it. But fundamentally, humanity has this power of cultural evolution, and is humanity's superpower. This is the thing that makes us different from all the other animals, is this power of cultural evolution. But it's a really simple thing. It's natural selection, variation selection. So in order for it to work, natural selection needs enough variation and enough selection pressures relative to the rates of drift and random change that would exist. And that's just a feature of natural selection in general, but it applies to cultural evolution. And the problem, I'm going to say, that I've discovered that seems to make sense, but it's hard to get other people to see it or to talk about it, is just that we broke the system. So 3 centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures, each had 1,000 or so people in it. Each of them was poor and close to the edge of subsistence, so it often suffers famines and wars and disease and pandemics. And when it made bad choices, it just died and got replaced by neighbors. And that was a healthy world of cultural evolution, even if, living in a poor peasant society isn't such a great life. But culture was very well selected and made adaptive by the process. And then what happened in the last few centuries is, first, we crushed little local peasant cultures into nations and made national cultures out of them and vastly reduced the variety. And then we actually merged national cultures into a world monoculture of elites. And so variety has gone way down. Selection pressures have gone way down because we're rich and we're peaceful and we're healthy. And in addition, the rates of change have gone way up, i.e. the environment is changing a lot faster in our world today. And add that to cultural activists who are causing even more changes to cultures that aren't adaptive. They're just due to these internal cultural processes. And so all 4 of these parameters have just gone wrong, plausibly meaning that this is no longer working, so that cultures are just drifting off the rails. They're just drifting into dysfunction. And that's the claim of the problem I've found, but I think I found a neglected important problem here. That is, culture is really important. You may not realize it, but it obviously just is. And if it's going wrong, that's obviously really important, but apparently it's neglected. And now I'm struggling with how to understand why it's neglected. So one of them is that the people who really have the basis for understanding it, their whole shtick is, we're just scientists and we don't comment on how to do policy. But another one is, most of the academic disciplines that house cultural evolution are really on the left, like ratios of 40 to 1, et cetera, or 80 to 1, Democrat to Republican. And the fundamental problem here is kind of actually the problem that conservatives have been complaining about for a long time, at least when they have any sort of consistency, which they often don't, is just that, hey, you guys are trying to change culture too fast. You're trying to get rid of divorce and get rid of gender roles, and you're trying to you're just trying to do all these changes, but you don't know what you're doing and you're risking a lot of stuff. Stop changing stuff. That's been the conservative complaint for a long time. And this message says they were basically right. And the left is really loves to celebrate these cultural activists who have been causing a lot of these cultural changes, which is part of causing the cultural drift. So I think that's also part of why that world is less eager to highlight and accept this as a problem, because it's basically saying some of the things they most celebrate are the cause of why we're going wrong. So that's the way in which it's another important neglected topic. So anyway, I think it should be obvious to you that if I'm right here, this is an important neglected topic. You might have doubts about whether I'm right. And then again, the puzzle for me is always how to explain how I seem to come across important neglected things and find an angle on them such that, but other people don't do the same thing. I don't get it. That's the puzzle of my word. I'm too weird to really have a good view of how I'm weird and how it is. But that makes me worried. Like maybe I'm just wrong.
Well,
I come up with an unusual view that other people don't see. Maybe I'm just not seeing how I'm wrong and they're right.
I think it's also your skill set. I think part of your skill set is being able to recognize the distortions between what the theory says the way it should be and the way things actually are. And even being able to recognize that is a skill set in and of itself. Then to think like, okay, well, this goes back to Andy's kind of like first question that we had on this podcast. Is it the case that, you're just too early to sync up this theory with the practical reality of things? Or is it the case that is the theory wrong or too early? Or is it just the fact that reality hasn't quite caught up? And I think that is kind of a dimension on its own to explore, and almost being the one to kind of push. That would be the activist point of view, would be to push the reality into the space where theory says it's okay and it makes sense again. Or the scientific point of view would say, no, we're just going to observe it and see how it goes. And kind of as we.
So, but this is an ancient, this is really old. So around 1900, a little bit before then or around then, among cultural elites, there was this big recognition or change that we were now in the modern era. And the modern era was quite different from the previous era. And they struggled to say what exactly it was. But most everybody agreed that essential features of the modern era was that we were changing things a lot more than people ever changed them before in culture, including elsewhere. And the one thing we all agreed was we did not want to go back to the past, that we were just going to have very different morals and social organization and attitudes toward thing, and that we were going to celebrate the people who were most exploring the space of new possibilities. And that modernism dominated in architecture and literature and other kinds of very well-respected artistic areas. That was this perception basically of, I would say, cultural drift, the perception that our cultural inheritance we were no longer attached to. It was too far away. We were moving fast away from that. And that we didn't really know where we were going, and we didn't really have a good guide to tell us which way to go. That was a consensus a century ago among our most respected cultural elites. But I don't think people didn't put that in the cultural evolution terms to say, that's bad, people. Do you get that that's bad? Because they saw it as heroic. They thought they were the wonderful explorers going into this grand new space of the modern and finding new modern ways of doing art and architecture and and sculpture and music and all sorts of, even other intellectual areas. They loved the idea that they were the moderns and that they had broken away from those stale habits of the past that had constrained people for so long to stay within certain cultural limits. But that was cultural drift. And we've been suffering that for the century. We've been drifting further away from where we started for a whole century. And now it's finally being realized in fertility. But it was going wrong in many other ways, plausibly, over that time, you see. So it's not something that's about to happen. That's the population decline. But the more fundamental problem of we lost our cultural anchor, we lost the cultural evolution process that picked out what cultures we were in and set those terms. We lost that process a long time ago, and we've been drifting away from it for a long time, is the inference I'm drawing here, the hypothesis I'm offering to you.
Is this a one directional drift? Or because
there's two parts, yes.
Go ahead.
So the key idea is natural selection had held us at a good spot. That's the idea. Like if an animal body has the right level of claws and furs, right, whatever, if it drifts away, it gets pushed back, right? If there's an optimal size of claws and fur for some animal, then natural selection will allow some variation, but like punish the deviance too far to keep it on track. And then if the environment changes, it gets colder, well, now more fur is appropriate, and then the animal will change slowly over time, right? So that's what's supposed to be happening with cultural evolution. We have this variety, but it's punished. Things that get too far away from the optimal spot get punished. And, up until a few centuries ago, we had all these little peasant cultures, and they were pretty well adapted to their local circumstances because of this vast variety of them and strong selection pressures. But then selection pressures weakened, and now there's two kinds of things that can go wrong. One kind of thing that can go wrong is you just do a random walk, drift away from wherever you were, and just any random place is worse than where you started because you started in a good place because there was this long process that put you there, right? But another way you can go wrong is if there was a way in which culture was holding humans in a place against human nature. So we could think humans had a nature, say hundreds of thousands, million years ago in a long actual history, and we had a certain environment we lived in, and then we had a nature and a set of habits that were evolved for that context. And then as the world changed and, say, farming became possible, civilization became possible, now cultural evolution moved our behavior away from human nature to the thing that was appropriate for our new cultural environment, like living in, farms and with war and more density and disease and, a whole bunch of, new marriage, even property, a whole bunch of new things that farmers had that their forager ancestors didn't have. So we had a whole new sort of set of cultural norms and values and practices that were adapted to that new farming situation. And then when the selection pressure just goes away, we just drift back toward human nature, the forager nature, our older human nature. And actually, that drift can explain a number of key trends here. Increasing democracy, decreasing slavery, decreasing religion, increasing leisure, increasing art, increasing travel, less domination. All of those are ways in which foragers are different from farmers, and that we've had those trends over the last few centuries. So a lot of our trends over the last few centuries can be understood as our drifting back to sort of a human nature. Or one of them is promiscuity. So basically, foragers were a lot more promiscuous than farmers. Farmers were held as farmers with repressive social pressures and punishment because humans were often naturally more promiscuous. And then once these selection pressures went away, we've drifted to be more promiscuous, to be more like what foragers were like as it became possible for us, being rich and at peace and healthy. So again, the prediction for our cultural drift and decay is that some of them are just random walks away from some particular place, but some of them are a drift back to a human nature. Another kind of human nature might be, plausibly, human nature is just naturally selfish, short-sighted, and lazy. That's just, humans have to be motivated to do anything else but to be selfish, short-sighted, and lazy. And culture did make us something else besides selfish, short-sighted, lazy. Culture had all sorts of structures to make us get up and work and pay attention to other people and think about the future. But selection pressures go away, and maybe we just drift back to being selfish, short-sighted, and lazy.
I can't help but to think that we're entering this postmodern era. So Robin and I are 25. I've been a digital nomad for 2.5 years. So very much like a forager by nature. And have...
It might feel natural, doesn't it?
I mean, it feels like it's actually, I'm moving to New York City in like 2 weeks, and if for like a 3-month lease, and that feels like a massive commitment. And so like just putting this into perspective, we grew up with, iPads and iPhones and things. We're like 10, 11, 12, came into, now the generation has all sorts of social media and all sorts of these kind of technological ways of creating connection. And then kind of we're advancing now towards AI being much, much more rapid in terms of its development and broader usage. And I can't help but to like take these take these mental models that you're building here and overlay them into today's world, where it feels like there's a lot of deflationary forces at hand by means of AI, by means of population decline over time, while simultaneously having a lot of also inflationary forces for various wars or programs or spendings, et cetera. And so it really puts us, it puts my generation and our outlook of the world in a really peculiar spot, because we are birthed, luckily, without debt to our parents, but a large debt to those who came before us by means of asset prices being higher than they ever had been. Like, there was this golden era of this modern era, per se, from 1970 to 2008, really, and then beyond, of everybody who was an asset owner having this large financial appreciation without really lifting a finger, per se. And so now we come into this world, and we feel like it's our responsibility to kind of like carry on what the previous have built before us. But I can also just open my phone, go smoke a joint, and go through Instagram and just text some people, hang out, go for a walk, jump on a plane. And like, why do I need to contribute to society when in 5 years I'm gonna have a robot here that will snap my finger and be like, hey, can I have a beer? And, can you solve this problem for me? And maybe just the elites have these tools, but what I'm getting at is it feels like we're going through the next era of arts and philosophy and learnings. And so I'm just curious whether from an economic perspective or through a thought exploration for just a pure humanity perspective, kind of any trends or thoughts or predictions around how you generally see society as a whole going through this next shift, and like anything, whether important and neglected, or potentially that others are not thinking about, that you think is clear as far as the consequences of like this next era when thinking about the deflationary forces, as well as kind of the current iteration of the state of the economy for our generation, per se.
The most insight I can offer you here is to frame this thing you're looking for in the light of this larger context. So the key thing to notice is that for a long time, we have been expecting cultural change and noticing there is a lot of cultural change even over our lifetimes. And we want people who will both tell us about this, help us frame it, help us understand it, maybe predict it. But we also want people who will be activists, telling us and motivating us which changes we're pushing for and we want to, hope for. And that's all part of what it is to be part of a culture today. And that's the process of cultural change that you've long been embedded in and probably never thought about whether it works. That is this process by which we all like notice changes and then talk about them and then argue for some being better than the others. That process is causing cultures to change. It's not just reacting and observing to change. It actually substantially causes culture to change. And that's uniquely human, of course. But that's also a striking fact about the modern world. That wasn't true thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago, cultures changed so slowly, in a lifetime, you hardly noticed any changes. And you weren't expecting them and you weren't trying to cause them. It's only in this recent era that we expect to see a lot of change, even in 20 years. We expect to have an opinion about which changes are good or bad. And we expect to even be taking sides, pushing the changes one way or the other. And in our world today, our biggest heroes are the people who both frame the changes for us and then argue which side we should be on. Those are our heroes. They are the people who get the most attention and sell the most books and, keynotes, conferences, and write the articles people read the most and argue the most about. Those are our heroes. And notice they are heroes who are about taking sides in these cultural fights and pushing for them. That is this world you live in. But what you should notice is you've never thought much about how that process works and where it came from, and
You just
whether
live
it's
through it.
broken.
You just exist in this system, in it, right?
Right, exactly. So the cultural evolution people are the specialists who sort of have learned about how that process works, but you've never been taught that, and nobody thinks that's very prestigious. Nobody assigns that to you in college or something, because people are so enamored with being part of this heroic battle of culture that they find it hard to step out of this heroic battle to see it as a natural selection process that where that natural selection doesn't necessarily take their side, you see. Like, it's like analyzing war from the point of view of how war works rather than that we want to win, right? A lot of, say, military history novels are all about our side and yay, we were winning and we did the right things here. But then a lot of military analysis is just saying, no, how does a war work? What are the factors that make you win or lose a battle? What are the better strategies? And so there's quite often those two different perspectives, right? There's the me as a participant view of how I could, participate and win and who my opponents are. And then there's this outside view of the battle seen neutrally by a third party, trying to guess what's going to happen and understanding the various moves you can make. So the key point to notice is culture is really a central process in our world, but you are hardly at all trained to see it from this third party point of view. You have a little training in biology to see that from a third party view, maybe business competition from a third party point of view, even military competition for some degree. You can understand, well, missiles might help if they go faster or whatever, but culture, no. But the point is, it is another sort of, forum in which people fight, and there is this third party neutral view to understand it as a process. And it, as a process, could just be going wrong compared to in the past. And that's my main message is this whole game you're playing, it's going wrong and it's causing us to just go farther wrong. But then you say, yeah, okay, but tell me who's winning and which side I should be on, which is sort of jumping to that, much more prestigious discussion people have about who's right about the various fights, right? We have intergenerational fights. We have fights across the world. We have fights left versus right. We have fights, rich versus poor. There's all sorts of these divisions and people, different groups aligning with themselves and different groups having their complaints about what was going wrong and how they've been mistreated and how, they need to get back at those people who mistreated us, et cetera, right? That's all very engaging. And it's very powerful, but have this ability to stand back from that and think about this whole process. How does it work and how does it go wrong?
Yeah. And through this, we could achieve an objective view of how the world actually works rather than being enamored by a particular side or an emotionally charged position of what we should be thinking.
So one hard thing is that when you think about this biology, so basically culture is it's biology. That is, it's a uniquely human kinds of biology, but it's basically just a natural selection process. And so there's this concept of adaptiveness that makes sense of biology. We can think of some concepts of more or less adaptive. But what adaptive means is that it will have more descendants and it will win more in conflicts, right? But when you think about culture in your fights, you don't tend to use the concept of adaptiveness as your standard. You use some sort of concept of morally right and fair, and you have all these other more personal ways by which you will judge cultural changes, like does it make people live longer or be happier or at peace, or and so you have opinions about all those things. But it's hard to get you to also see this concept of adaptiveness, which is how biology is judging these things, and it's how the third party judge of the things that goes. Basically, like in war, we would talk about military power as an explanation for who wins war. But when you're arguing for our side to win the war, you tend to want to focus on we're just and those people did the bad things and we got to retaliate, blah blah blah, right? And so again, in culture, the question biologically from the distance is, are the cultures getting more or less adaptive, and which parts of them are getting more or less adaptive, and how to understand how that would be going. Because the general process and over the long run was to make cultures more adaptive. So if they're becoming less adaptive, that's this deviation from the usual trend, and you try and understand, well, how could that be happening?
Yeah, what's uniquely interesting about that from the way that my entrepreneur brain works is that having a more holistic worldview from this kind of polymath perspective that you laid out, identifying these areas of adaptiveness and what you described as maladaptiveness, and then discovering if there's actually products, solutions, ideas, and change that needs to be implemented at some scale, and using this as a way to do that.
So we don't have that much time left, but let me just connect this back to, say, discussion of Futarchy and blockchain, which is, it may be that the era of cultural evolution is coming to an end and that we can't actually fragment into 100,000 cultures anymore and have this whole separate thing, which means we need a new way to make these cultural change choices in order to prevent this cultural drift and collapse. So actually, Futarchy is one of my candidate solutions. That is, plausibly, the cultural drift we're facing is going to cause population to peak and then decline and civilization to decline. And that's going to make civilization less capable of doing lots of things. So if we could have a government, a community of people who used a Futarchy with a goal that was inconsistent with collapse, then, and they were willing to stick with it, then maybe they could prevent collapse. So I did some surveys about what sort of goals that could inspire enough devotion that were inconsistent with the collapse. And some of them were about space, like when do 1 million people live in space, or when do we get to another star? Another was about immortality. But the key point is, those could be seen as sacred goals. So if a community could say, we are the community devoted to when 1 million people live in space, that's a thing we're devoting ourselves to. And we're going to empower a Futarchy to actually make that happen. Then when it started to, implement policies we didn't like, that had temporary pain and cost to them, then if we weren't very devoted to this long-term goal, we would just drop it, say, to hell with that. We don't like that anymore, right? But if it's a long-term sacred goal that we've devoted ourselves to, we might be proud to pay these costs and to be sacrificing, because that's often what happens when people feel they have a sacred goal and they are asked to sacrifice for it. They are especially motivated by sacrificing for a sacred goal. So, and if the sacred goal was inconsistent with collapse, then the government might be figuring out how to prevent the collapse, therefore how to prevent the drift, because otherwise it couldn't achieve the goal. So the point is, if we just did this with an ordinary form of government like we have now, they're so ineffective that they wouldn't actually achieve the goal. They would just claim to be doing it in our name and maybe making us pay some costs, but then it wouldn't actually work. But if you have a form of government that actually is effective at achieving a goal, and you give it the goal of when 1 million people live in space, and say, we want that date to be as soon as possible, and we authorize you to do what it takes to change our policies and practices in order to make that happen. And then it starts to do things we don't like that are at odds with our immediate inclinations. But we say, and we believe that that's because that's what it'll take to achieve this long-term sacred goal. Then we might say, let it continue. Let's pay the cost and let's achieve this goal. And if that goal is inconsistent with collapse, then if we effectively achieve it, we will effectively have prevented collapse and therefore effectively have overcome the problems. But fundamentally, we will have replaced sort of this intuitive cultural competition process you see with this governance mechanism that's going to manage that in some way as to make it not go so terribly wrong. Look, so this is a big ask, I get. But part of the thing to notice is this problem we're facing is a really hard problem, and there are no obvious, easy solutions. But one of the solutions is using something like Futarchy, i.e. a form of governance that you can give a particular concrete goal and that it would be very effective at actually achieving that goal. A thing you can do with that is then choose together a sacred goal that's inconsistent with collapse, but also has attractiveness in terms of a sacred thing we could devote ourselves to and be willing to sacrifice for. So it can't just be the goal of preventing collapse, because apparently people don't care so much about that. But they might care about immortality, say. If we are the community devoted to creating immortality, then let's let that happen. So
I feel like Bitcoin and crypto was kind of earthed and unearthed on this idea around just kind of a non-state form of money. And it's like it's this goal, it's to build this alternative system inconsistent with collapse. But perhaps we have a little bit of refining of the cultural mission at large.
Unfortunately, I think a collapsed civilization could still have Bitcoin working. You could still have crypto working. So if we devoted ourselves to making sure we had, Bitcoin working and kept working, that isn't enough to prevent population
Certainly
decline and
not.
other sorts of collapse.
I just have one last question for you before we go. I know we have a couple minutes. It's a broad question. Feel free to take it wherever. Question is, what unpopular idea do you believe that most of your colleagues are currently dismissing, which will be obvious in 10 to 20 years?
Well, it's that obvious part that's the hard part. That is a lot of the things I believe. I'm just not sure when they will be clear. They could just take a very long time. Like, for example, there are people who have studied meteorites who have fallen down from Earth and looked inside and think they've already found alien life in those meteorites. And when I look at that, I'm kind of persuaded. I say, yes, they have. And then what happens is the astrophysicists just have crazy high standards and they say, yeah, we don't care what you see in there. That's not proof. And then they just insist we need to keep, doing more things because we still don't know, right? And a lot of, say, NASA funding comes from the fact that they're saying, well, we're out there searching for life for you. We need to give us money. So I guess they think that if they just say they found it, that they won't get the money anymore. So that's a thing I believe, but I don't know that in 20 years that'll change his mind because actually, there was a first paper in 1961 showing that stuff. And then they basically made the journal retracted and fired the guy for publishing in the top journal that he had found this stuff. So basically, a lot of the things that I might believe that disagree with a consensus, it's because there's this force behind the consensus that maintains it. And it's not obvious that that force will go away in 20 years, right? That's the key question, which when there's a consensus, maintaining some view and making sure people conform to it, those can just last a really long time. So, but, I have contrarian views I think there are good evidence for, and often it's because there is some pressure to hold a different view. That's the reason why other people don't hold that view.
Kind of brings me back to the self-fulfilling and self-refuting prophecies of the prediction markets conversation as well. Robin, it's been a pleasure. Really kind of covered a wide variety of topics as expected. Appreciate your time and sharing some ideas for our community. And love to have you back on in the future as the world progressively gets weirder and weirder, faster and faster.
It's already pretty weird. I don't know if it's going to get weirder, but it's going to keep staying weird. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robin.
All right. Nice to meet you all.
Likewise.